Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the President's Fellow Podcast. Tonight I am joined again by Keith Preston to continue our series on U.S. foreign policy. This is the first of a two-part episode on the Cold War. And I think a good place to pick up is where we left off with World War II. I think it's hard for people to realize that, except for the United States, most of the world is absolutely devastated. Most of the first world. There wasn't much fighting going on in South America, but if you go to like Europe, East Asia, Russia, complete and utter devastation. And I think people have a hard time understanding that besides the United States, everybody else was just devastated. So it's pretty, it makes sense that the United States at that time was in the driver's seat, so to speak. The Soviets had just lost anywhere from 10 to 20 million people in World War II, suffered massive economic and environmental damage. When the Nazis invaded, they were treated with scorched earth. The Soviet army did. And then the German army were treated with scorched earth in 43 and beyond. So Russia was absolutely devastated. So their ability to project power outside of its own sphere of influence was, if it meant firm U.S. resistance, would be somewhat limited. If the United States had the wherewithal to stand up against them, they had a lot to recover from. And we really were in the driver's seat. We had all the cards. And the opening phases of the Cold War should have gone very differently than they actually did. We shouldn't have lost China. We shouldn't have given... The communists, by rights, were so politically weak, militarily weak, they shouldn't have made the gains they did. But part of that is the result of the communist subversion we touched on in World War II that got us involved with Japan. Those communist spy rings that were feeding us misinformation and disinformation about Japan to prevent the Second Front from the Japanese were still active in the United States. And there was this, I forget his name, I think it was Owen Littmore. And he was, they were saying garbage like Mao Zedong was an agrarian reformer, the Chinese Thomas Jefferson, ridiculous things like that. And one of the main culprits was the Rockefellers. They had an organ, which is unfortunately at the time, the only U.S. institution that was an expert on East Asian foreign policy. And they, for whatever reasons, believed that the Mao was more conducive to their longer-range strategic interests. There were many congressional investigations on this in the 50s, and some fairly damning material was brought up connecting the Rockefellers with Mao, and how they spread disinformation and misinformation to U.S. policy planners in order to ultimately betray Chiang Kai-shek. See, Chiang Kai-shek in China was winning. The troops that he had trained by the United States, firstly by... I can't remember the first guy, but Wiedemeyer and Stilwell. Stilwell was the first guy. They were crack forces. In Burma, they performed very well against the Japanese, led under Stilwell's leadership. And they had American training and equipment. And in the opening salvos of the Chinese Civil War, after the Japanese surrendered, the first mistake we made was the nationalists asked us to use our air superiority to airlift them to strategic locations throughout China. Wiedemeyer was in full support of this, but the U.S. government was not. And so the communist Chinese were able to escape their base in Yan'an and very quickly infest Manchuria, which of course was Soviet occupied, and other parts of northern China. The second mistake was the insane and arguably treasonous order by Marshall to have the nationalists stop their invasion of Manchuria. Prior to that, they had airlifted to the Guangdong province of Manchuria hundreds of thousands of forces for a pincer attack on the communist capital of Harbin. And as far as I can tell, no effective resistance had been offered by the communists after the Japanese surrender. And that 6 months was crucial in losing China because the communists got training from the Russians. 100,000 North Koreans joined the forces. They were able to cannibalize Japanese weapons that were left behind, and they were able to organize an effective force. Now, by the time the truce was over, the nationalist army had been the victim of a U.S. embargo. We wouldn't let them buy weapons or from us, and the ones they had bought before, we didn't even deliver them, as Wiedemeyer points out. In the Chinese white papers, Wiedemeyer points out that the nationalist fighting spirit was not in question. It's their ability to continue the fight that was in question. They weren't given the weapons that they had bought and paid for. The economy was, of course, running riot with hyperinflation, and the U.S. the communist double agent Harry Dexter White had sabotaged a gold shipment that would have likely maintained the solvency of the nationalist economy. So at every step of the way, through either incompetence or direct treasonous activity, the United States benefited the Maoist forces in giving them every possible advantage. And this really gets to the point of what we saw with Roosevelt and Truman, this infatuation with communism. And the consequences were disastrous for the world. And again, this should not have happened. The United States was the most powerful nation in the world at that time and could have pretty much done whatever it wanted had we made, the proper precautions in China. We could have avoided 2 wars in Korea and Vietnam that claimed 100,000 American lives, and then a brutal dictatorships in North Korea, Vietnam, and China that killed tens of millions of lives. So what are your thoughts on that, Keith? I think you muted yourself, Keith. There you go.
All right. Okay, there's a number of important things to consider when we're talking about the development of American foreign policy after the end of World War II. The one is what you mentioned, which is the fact that the rest of the world was pretty much laid to waste in the war. Asia and Europe, which was the developed world at the time, most of the rest of the world was extraordinarily underdeveloped during that time period. And so really the United States was the only functional industrial society that was left anywhere in the world. So naturally the United States achieved not only military supremacy, but also economic supremacy during that 1950s era, which is part of the reason why the United States had this unprecedented level of economic prosperity during that time period. We had the largest middle class in world history. We had the middle class with the highest standard of living in world history, the most technologically advanced society in world history. So really an extraordinary position for the United States to be in. Along with that, the American foreign policy makers, I believe, always viewed themselves as the rightful heirs to the old European colonial empires. One of the effects of World War II was that all of the European states were devastated by the war and could no longer function internally on their own, much less maintain their overseas colonies. So one by one, you start to see the overseas colonies that the European states had developed gaining their independence in Africa and Asia and in the Middle East. That's one thing that's extremely important. And then I think within that framework, the Americans came to view themselves as the rightful heir to these empires, where they would simply take the former colonial empires and incorporate them into an American client state system. And American imperialism was never, well, certainly not during this time period, was never about the traditional colonialism as much as it was about creating these networks of client states that are under American hegemony, but they're not colonies in a formal sense. I think that's one thing it's important to recognize. As far as the Cold War, it was also during this time that communism started to spread throughout much of the world, and there were a lot of reasons for that. One was the fact that the prestige of the Soviet Union was enhanced tremendously by the victory of the Allies in the war, because the Russians were viewed as the folks who defeated Nazi Germany in Eastern Europe, and also the communists, including the Soviet state, began to develop a very rhetorical anti-imperialism during this time period. It's interesting to go back though and look at the actual history of Marxist theory, and you see, if you actually read Marx and Engels, you see that they were actually very pro-imperialist. They had the same views of imperialism as the liberal imperialists did. That imperialism was about bringing advancement and civilization to all the backward peoples of the world. And that was just as true of Marxist and Engels thinking as it was the liberal imperialists of their time. And Marxist anti-imperialism begins with Lenin, in the sense that Lenin, in my view, Lenin developed an anti-imperialist line in large part because he wanted to rally the third world nations on behalf of the Soviet Union. And this was a policy that the Soviet Union continued throughout much of its history. Ironically, Mussolini did the same thing early in his career, early in the period of the fascist regime in Italy. But anti-imperialism really became one of the premier communist causes of the mid-20th century, and in one nation after another, you see communist parties that are affiliated with the Soviet Union developing, and they're using this anti-imperialist line as a means of achieving national independence, and you see this in nation after nation after nation. That's another thing that I think really had the effect of fueling the Cold War. Now, one thing that's interesting too is that what you were pointing out about China. When we think of the relationship between the United States and communist nations in the 20th century, we tend to think of this antagonistic relationship of the type that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union with the arms race and all of that. And it's certainly true that all of that was real, but it was also true that in nations where there was a communist insurgency, the United States would also frequently try to co-opt these into their own camp. And I think that's what they were initially trying to do with the communist movement in China. The Americans tended to view the traditional societies in the third world the same way that the Soviets did, in the sense that they were viewed as backward, reactionary societies, and that they needed to be brought into civilization and so forth. And I think both camps in the Cold War viewed nationalist they viewed anti-imperialist movements in this way, except both sides wanted to co-opt them for their own side in the Cold War. And from what I know of the relationship between the United States, for example, and Cuba, the United States and Nicaragua, the United States and China, it appears that whenever these communist-led anti-imperialist movements would develop in these places, the strategy of the United States would be to first try to co-opt these and bring them into the American sphere of influence. And then when that did not work, then they would turn against them. But there was usually an effort at co-optation before counterinsurgency programs and things like that were implemented. And the issue was the Americans wanted access to the resources that these nations had, and also wanted to keep them from falling into the sphere of Soviet influence. I think the Soviets and the Americans had somewhat different objectives in the Cold War. For the Americans, I think economics was very much a primary driving force. The Americans simply wanted access to all the resources that these nations had. And like I said, they viewed themselves as the rightful heirs to the old colonial empires of Europe, which were largely economic empires as well. The Soviets, I think, were more oriented towards preventing the expansion of American imperialism in that sense, but also ideological expansionism of their own and geopolitical expansionism rather than economic imperialism. If anything, I think the Soviet foreign policy was actually very costly to the Soviets. It was actually very costly to the Soviets to maintain their control over Eastern Europe, over their client states in the third world and so forth. So the economics of the relationships that the two blocs had with their various clients, I think, was somewhat different in that regard. But I do think both sides had a similar perspective in the sense that they thought they were bringing civilization and all of that and modernity to all these underdeveloped and backward peoples. The situation in China it was interesting, though, because as we talked about a little bit in the last program, I really don't think that the Communist Revolution of 1949 would have happened without the destruction of Japan in World War II. That's really what paved the way for the Communist Revolution. In fact, it's what paved the way for all of the Communist revolutions that happened in Asia and East Asia during the 20th century, not only in China, but even a year earlier in 1948 in Korea with the coming to power of Kim Il Sung, and of course later with Ho Chi Minh coming to power in Vietnam and so forth. So the real victor of the defeat of Japan, in the defeat of Japan in Asia, was really Eastern communism, which tended to be a much more extreme and fanatical kind than even what you found in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. So it's interesting how that paradox plays out. One thing that we don't hear much about, though, is that ultimately there were a lot of rivalries that developed in the communist world between the Soviet Union and between Third World communist movements, even between the Russians and the Chinese. There was the Sino-Soviet split, for example, in 1958, and that was entirely predictable because the Russians and the Chinese had never gotten along very well, and we wouldn't expect them to, given that they were large nations that shared a border and both had a history of autocratic rule and that kind of thing, and as well as xenophobia and things of that nature. So it's not at all to be unexpected that even under this supposed universal ideology of communism, that the two nations would eventually have a falling out with one another, and that's more or less what they did. I tend to look at it like that. Really, when the Sino-Soviet split happened in 1958, that really put an end to any hopes that the communist world would have had of eventually achieving complete world domination, because they weren't able to achieve unity within their own ranks. And also in Europe, there was the split between Marshal Tito and Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union as well. And then you've also found some of the Soviet client states or vassalages, or whatever you want to call them, in Eastern Europe. You found some of those trying to reform themselves internally and were breaking away from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union retaliated by sending in tanks and clamping down on that, like in Hungary and in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia and in Poland. But you also had other situations where some of the Eastern European states eventually started moving away from the Soviet bloc towards China. I think the main issue the Soviets had with the protest movements in places like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia was some of those tended to be pro-Western. But you also had Enver Hoxha's Albania, and as well as well, I guess that was the main example, Enver Hoxha's Albania, that was actually moving towards Maoism at one point. So there was a tremendous amount of disunity among the communist world as well, and I think that actually ultimately undermined any kind of hopes they had for any kind of global unity or eventual, achievement of world hegemony.
Yeah, we see that M. Stanton Evans, the late M. Stanton Evans, he wrote Blacklisted by History, which is about MacArthur, McCarthy, and he and his warnings about communist infiltration. So, because initially the whole point was he wanted to say this didn't happen. He didn't believe that McCarthy was correct. But as he dug deeper, he realized that McCarthy was onto something, and there was this communist infiltration. And I think the way that we can explain given America's commanding position after World War II, why the situation in Asia deteriorated so rapidly was because of these communist agents planted within the government. Eventually, they were weeded out, in part due to McCarthy's efforts to smoke them out. But to contrast China with a successful counterinsurgency against Marxists, we have two. We have one in Greece, going on around the same time, and then one in the Philippines against the Hooks. And in neither case did the United States require the governments to have the pro-Western governments to collaborate with and bring the communists into their government. Only in China was that made. Obviously China was a much bigger windfall for the communists. So they played their cards right when they got that country. But it really, we see again going this trend going back to World War II with the alliance with the Soviet Union. Even before that, in the 1930s, with the Treaty of Recognition in 1933, where Roosevelt makes the deal to diplomatically recognize the Soviet Union. The Soviets never, ever live at their end of the bargain. I think the 33 treaty was they were supposed to allow open democratic elections, which of course they never did. So we already knew even then that they were not trustworthy. One of the things that's most interesting, this is kind of a crossover into Korea, is an article that was a speech that was ghostwritten for McCarthy by Francis Parker Yockey, America's Two Ways of Waging War. And in there, he gets into this whole argument that, in World War II, total victory, never surrender, bring as many people on board to smash fascism, and no sacrifice is too great, no cost is too great, onward to final victory. Whereas when you get to Korea, we won't allow the nationalist Chinese. Chiang Kai-shek offered to send troops to Korea. We said no. We wanted to contain Korea. We didn't want more nations to get involved. We really weren't willing to use the measures necessary to defeat communism in Korea. And it's this sort of duality that we see throughout the Cold War. This half measures against communism, or indecision, which you never would have seen in the war with Germany or in Japan, and to some extent the war against Saddam Hussein once we invaded Iraq in 2003. These sort of half measures where, we can't go too far here or too far there because this or that or whatever. It's a good point that Yockey brings up. It's they're like, well, maybe we don't want, as Bradley said, it is the wrong war. Where does he say this? Yeah, the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemy. No, Bradley, that was Japan in 1941, not China in 1950. The sheer obvious hypocrisy of it all is just unbelievable. So Japan, we couldn't just live with. We just couldn't have a non-aggression pact or something, or a truce. Total victory, leveling cities with bombs and nukes. But China, which was going to then murder tens of millions of people, we just need to get along. We just need to the communist Chinese, they're reasonable. And it's this fundamental. I think there's two reasons why. One, there were active communist sympathizers along with the agents in the government. But the other thing, too, I think the alt-right has a correct criticism here, that American liberalism has always been Marxism light. The American liberals, the British liberals, have always favored socialism, Marxism, wherever it's shown itself. And I think part of it is the Western liberals, they like the values of egalitarianism, and they also kind of like the strongman, the premier, the Stalin, the great leader, that will enforce this orthodoxy of egalitarianism. But for whatever reason, they're not, if you want to use the word courageous, they're not men of action that could do that. They wish they could be those kinds of leaders in order to make everything equal and bring in the new utopia. So, but I think the alt-right is largely correct, and this explains a lot of the indecisions and it's just bizarre behavior of the United States in coddling communists throughout the world, while we're supposed to be fighting them at the same time, is that we really were kind of like Marxism light. At least the Democratic liberals. But even with the Republicans, I mean, Eisenhower doesn't really put the screws on the Soviets. I mean, it's ultimately Eisenhower that signs the truce with China. Well, we could never imagine, Roosevelt or Truman signing a truce with Japan. No, unconditional surrender with Japan. So those are my thoughts on that. What do you think about that alt-right analysis and Yockey's view?
Well, there's a number of different considerations there. As far as Japan, one of the issues there was, of course, the United States had actually been attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor and had engaged in direct combat with Japan for a number of years. So I think that the thirst for total victory was fueled by that in part. But it's also true, though, that during the 1950s, the United States had already come out of this World War where hundreds of thousands of Americans had been killed. and which had certainly been very costly in a lot of respects. I don't know that there was that much political will for more large scale warfare of that kind. Now, it is interesting that during the Korean War, which happened started only 5 years after the conclusion of World War II, you did have a fairly large number of American casualties in that, about 36,000 people, and yet you had no real anti-war movement or anything like that, the way that you had actually prior to World War II or during World War I or during the Vietnam War. It's kind of interesting in the sense that the Korean War was a time when it was a fairly significant war, but at the same time there was not much in the way of domestic opposition to it that I'm aware of, in the way that there was these other wars. So that's one thing that's interesting to consider. But the as far as what you were saying about the Western liberalism being Marxism light, that may be something of an exaggeration, but I do think that there are some parallels in the sense that Western liberalism and Eastern Marxism are similar to each other in the sense that while Marxism is anti-liberal, they're both modernist philosophies, and they're both have this kind of progressive view of history where they view themselves as advancing civilization to a new stage of enlightenment and development and progress and things like that. That is something that Western liberals and Marxists share in common. And if you go back and you read, for example, Soviet propaganda about their invasion of Afghanistan, they were pretty much saying the same thing about Afghanistan and that the Bush administration said in 2003, or 2001 rather, when they invaded Afghanistan. You know, we're bringing Western values and we're bringing civilization and women's rights and democracy and all these kinds of things, albeit framed within a liberal rhetorical framework rather than a Marxist one. But other than that, it's pretty much the same set of ideas. So I think that is something that Western liberals and Marxists share in common. And Carl Schmitt actually wrote about that a bit. He in his work Nomos of the Earth, which was something he did during the post-war, during the Cold War period. He talked a little bit about how the rival powers in the Cold War were actually very similar to each other, in a sense that they both had this kind of messianic revolutionary ideology, although the details of the specific details of the ideology varied a bit. But it still had this same kind of operative functioning on a cycle, and which in turn was translated into a similar geopolitical framework. The idea of whether or not liberals are basically wannabe communist strongmen, I'm not sure what to make of that. On one hand, Western liberalism does have certain features to it that Marxism rejects. I think it's problematic to say that Marxism and Western liberalism are just variants of each other. There are important differences between the two. Marxism I see as a repudiation of the Western liberal tradition, even while it keeps other aspects of modernity. It keeps this emphasis on progress and this emphasis on technology and all of these kinds of things, but it does tend to it openly rejects the liberal aspects of Western liberalism. But I do think that a lot of intellectuals in the West and presumably policymakers and others as well have a similar view, or had a similar view of third world Marxist movements, in the sense that they thought of them as, basically being, like you were saying about Mao, agrarian reformers with an excessive amount of zeal. That does tend to be how Western liberals view the Marxists, or viewed the Marxists as, they're basically about land reform and throwing off colonialism and the old feudal orders and that kind of thing, and modernizing their own societies. And I still see contemporary Marxists making arguments like that as well. In fact, within the Stalinist camp now, there's a lot of analysis like that is actually favorable to regimes like Syria and like Iran, because they will say, well, Syria and Iran are actually trying to modernize. They'll say Syria is a modern secular state, and Iran is now a modernizing state, even if it's not secular, as opposed to the kind of reactionary feudalism you find in the Gulf states and things like that. So within the Stalinist camp nowadays, even you see, ironically, a lot of sympathy for these third world regimes that are, actually theocratic or even quasi-fascist in some instances. That's interesting to observe as well. I suppose liberalism could be a sort of a less extreme version of that, and does seem to be in many ways. I know when the war in Central America was going on in the 1980s, the American left was very pro-Sandinista in Nicaragua and very pro-rebel in Guatemala and in El Salvador. Now, I was involved in the anti-war movement. My perspective on it at the time, then as now, was basically more of a non-interventionist. That is, the Americans should simply stay out of it, more so than supporting any of the sides in the particular war. Although most people I knew in the anti-war movement at the time tended to have a very pro-Sandinista, pro-FMLN, whatever perspective, which I didn't really share. I always took a more skeptical view of all that. But I think, though, that it was the same principle in operation there, this idea that these third world revolutionaries are agrarian reformers who are, bringing, literacy and health care and land reform and women's rights and all these kinds of things to their societies. And you still see, even today, you see people saying that about Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and characters like that. Nowadays among the alt-right, it's fashionable, or not just the alt-right, but even mainstream conservatives, it's fashionable to make jokes about campus leftists, counterculture, social justice warrior, Antifa types that wear the T-shirts with the Che Guevara pictures on them, which is, ironic considering he was a racist who executed homosexuals and hippies. But even when Castro died, you still had people lauding him as this kind of land reform guy, or guy who reformed Cuba's educational system or brought free health care to Cuba. So there is some kind of overlap in the thinking of the two camps.
Yeah. That overlap, maybe this case can be overstated, but I think that is an important consideration, understanding the policy decisions that the United States has made. Obviously, from a foreign policy perspective, the biggest thing to deal with in the early Cold War period is, of course, the Korean War. Basically, the Korean War of Kim wanted to unite the peninsula under communism, and Stalin, for his purposes, wanted, from what I can gather, he seemed to want to test the resolve of the West. He wanted to see how far can we go before the United States hits back, because we had Ethiopia, and I know it's going to sound like the neocon narrative, but this is how a guy like Stalin thinks, right? He saw the European powers not directly confront Italy or Germany early on, and he thought, well, maybe I could make a move like that too. And Kim was ready-made. Kim wanted to move in. Mao was also brought on board as well, because Korea was always seen as a kind of a Chinese sphere of influence anyhow, and having it under communism, since Mao was communist, would make a lot of sense from his perspective to do that. And so the initial pitch to Stalin was like in 1948, I think. The Civil War was still going on in China, so Stalin said, no, we got to wait, not yet. But in 1950, the nationalists had been defeated. They'd withdrawn to Formosa, and Stalin thought the time was ripe. And this is actually, I think, one of the few cases where the United States fought a war that could be considered justifiable. We have clear aggressors, the communists. In fact, we were afraid that Syngman Rhee would be the aggressor, so we made sure that the constabulary army of South Korea was woefully undermanned and woefully under-equipped. And it's hard for people to understand how badly we got defeated in the opening days of Korea. The North Korean army was a crack force, elite. The guerrilla war against Japan, veterans of the Chinese Civil War, equipped with some of the most up-to-date equipment from the Soviet Union, the T-34 tanks of the art, because this is like only 5 years after World War II. They would later be given MiGs, Chinese, and a handful of Soviet aces from the war to contest air superiority with the United States. And yeah, they just hold up at Pusan. I mean, it was bad. The ROC forces were completely outclassed. The U.S. forces were also completely outclassed. They were too busy drinking sake in Japan. They weren't prepared at all for what was coming. And the big windfall for the UN forces was when MacArthur did the Incheon landings. Once we defended the Pusan perimeter, the UN forces would have eventually outnumbered the communists. But fighting up the peninsula would have been a long, difficult slog that would have cost many more lives than were actually lost. What MacArthur did was crucial. And the forces then catapulted, after the Incheon landings, catapulted up to the Yalu. And we kind of thought it was all sewed up. But the Chinese, of course, were preparing to intervene. And while we had some knowledge of it, it's complicated because on the one hand, it is a credible threat. But there's other problems as well, because we tend to think of Vietnam as the first war where the U.S. commanding officer was given lots of limitations, lots of restraints. But MacArthur was actually under a tremendous number of restrictions that actually are quite similar to those that we went under Vietnam. And one of them was, and this was crucial, there were strategic bridges on the Yalu River that the Chinese needed to transport their forces across to forces, quote, volunteers. And he wanted to bomb those bridges because he said that, well, they would either prevent or disrupt Chinese troop movements. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs said, no, the rivers are going to freeze soon, so it's not worth the risk. World War II, yeah, don't blow up the bridges the Germans are using. It might freeze over in a few months, but yeah, we'll just leave the bridges intact. Absolutely no way. There's no way the U.S. would have engaged in a conflict like that. And that was really a disaster, because then the Chinese came over in force and retook Seoul. I think Korea is the forgotten war because we got an ass kicking. I mean, we really did. This third world peasant army drives us, from the Yalu to south of Seoul. It's probably not something that the United States wants to remember. We had complete air superiority the whole time. That shouldn't be forgotten as well. But ultimately, the limitations of China's military forces came to the fore. They were a peasant third world army. And against the overwhelming U.S. firepower, they lost a lot of guys. And they could not, as their supply lines got extended, they could not push the U.S. beyond a certain point. And we dug in after MacArthur was fired. Ridgway came in. Things got straightened up again, and then just ended up fighting around the parallel for the next 2 years, until finally there was a truce. One of the driving factors of keeping the war going was Stalin. Stalin wanted to see China and the U.S. bleed each other out. China, I don't think he fully trusted Mao, and the U.S., of course, was his main enemy. To duke it out was for his interests, and he could put a lot of pressure on China and North Korea to keep going. But when he finally died, that seemed to be one of the crucial points on the communist side for allowing the negotiations to reach their conclusion. So unique about Korea as a conflict is it was the first real war the United States did not walk away from as a clear victor. We were at a peace table. We're at the table with the communist Chinese, treating them as equals and signing a truce. That's a far cry from the Japanese surrender on the battleship Missouri. And a lot of Americans knew about that. Certainly MacArthur was like, how is this a problem? How is this even happening? One of the things that you'll hear as well is that MacArthur kind of was an unhinged lunatic. I think that's a bit unfair. Certainly some of the claims, like bombing the bridges makes a lot of sense. Now, the counter arguments were that would escalate the war. Well, the Chinese had already intervened. I mean, what were they going to do more than what they'd already done? They're still a third world peasant army. So they'd already intervened. So I don't understand why Truman thought, well, they'd escalate it. They already did. They intervened, and they're fighting us under false pretenses. And so were the Soviets. You know, they had we knew very early on that they had an Air Force gutting our guys over. And you know, if you watch documentaries or talk to fighter pilots from Korea, they're like, oh yeah, we fought over MiG Alley all the time, shooting guys over Manchurian airspace. So there was this kind of idea that, you know, both sides knew some irregularities were going on, but they just kind of let it go. Because at the end of the day, we had all the cards. We had all the nukes. We had the commanding. We had the naval support, the economic support, and we really played with half a deck in that war. And again, it's one of those, as Yaki points out, we didn't want to win in Korea. We didn't really want to beat the Soviets, beat the communists. I think that's one of the takeaways. Now, we did save South Korea, which is of tremendous value. Can you imagine South Korea today under Kim Jong-un? It'd be a nightmare. But yeah, that's sort of a brief breakdown of Korea. Is there anything you'd like to add on the Korean War, Keith?
Well, I do think that particular war marks something of a transformation of war as Americans traditionally fought war. You mentioned that it's really the first war where the United States didn't win, and that's true. And because I think that's a big part of that was the fact that this was the time when war was starting to undergo a transformation from the model of wars between states, where you have a state with its own, each state has its own army, and then one state beats the other, and then there's a surrender process and all of that, which is the way World War II ended. But what you start to see after World War II is that wars become a lot more messy. They become, I mean, maybe that's not the right way to put it. I mean, World War II was certainly messy, but
more ambiguous.
Yeah, they're more ambiguous in the sense that there's not really a clear victor in a lot of wars. Like if you look at all the wars that have happened since then, if you look at Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the two wars in Iraq, and all of that, we see that there's never really been a clear winner in terms of in terms of why did this war turn out the way it did. I mean, now we could say that, well, Kim won the Korean War in the sense that he wasn't totally defeated and put out of power. He still maintained control of the North. And we can say the communists won the Vietnam War mostly just through attrition. But and then the same thing that we said about Iraq and Afghanistan. But we start to see this situation where the United States is no longer fighting states per se, as much as they're fighting insurgent armies. Now, some of these insurgent armies may have been aligned with states, but it's really more of the kind of fourth generation model of warfare that Bill Lind and people like that talk about. And the United States showed that it had a tremendous capability to fight second generation warfare of the type that developed in World War I, or well, I guess it started to develop during the U.S. Civil War. But this idea of a total war where the whole society is committed to a war where you have mass armies fielded by rival states, and you not only do you have the use of advanced technology in the fighting of war, but there's also a certain formality to the war process of the kind you find in older forms of warfare. After World War II, all of that disappears, and you have less of a focus on wars between states, in part because nuclear weapons made those kinds of wars cost prohibitive in many ways. The focus shifted in the post-war period to wars between states and fourth generation or non-state entities to a large degree. So the United States went from fighting state armies to fighting guerrilla insurgencies. Now, maybe some of which were backed by states, but the focus of it was essentially fighting guerrilla insurgencies, a state trying to fight a guerrilla insurgency. In the United States, as well as powerful states generally, have proven themselves to be very inept at that. The Soviet Union was very inept at fighting that kind of warfare as well. So apparently there's something about the kind of cumbersome state bureaucracy that you find in a traditional military that's simply not capable of fighting guerrilla warfare in in a very effective way because it lacks the kind of flexibility and maneuverability that a guerrilla army has. And I think that's one of the key transformations that happened during this time period. The Korean War was the part of the beginning of this, but you see the same process unfolding up until the present period as well. So it's really been going on ever since.
Yeah. Now, in the case of Korea, though, there were still largely regular forces, the Chinese army. Vietnam, we certainly see this in its full potential. Another interesting factor, too, that the United States had a hard time dealing with in Korea, and as we'll see later in Vietnam as well, because these are basically third world peasant societies, there aren't a lot of targets to bomb because the industry that's supplying these weapons are actually out of country. It's coming from the Soviet Union, not from China, not from Korea, not from Vietnam. And that's really the problem here. Now, the idea of a limited war, which is what Korea was, the the great powers, say between the 30 Years' War and World War I, had fought many, many limited wars, even between great powers like the Franco-Prussian War or the Crimean War between, on the one hand, France, Ottoman Empire, and Britain, and then Russia on the other side. So even great powers could fight limited wars and it wouldn't get out of control. I think part of it is the American psyche of war. When they go to war, they don't know how to win a limited war because the British did far better with the insurgency in Malaysia. But they had more experience fighting these limited wars of the great powers. They had almost a millennium-long history going back to William the Conqueror, where they had empire building and managing these societies. And the United States, I think we tend to think that if you don't have an all-out, Missouri surrender sequence, we don't win. And so we don't know how to articulate winning in a limited war. And Korea was part of that rude awakening. A far better outcome for the U.S. could have been achieved in Korea, possibly even a reunification of the peninsula, had certain steps been taken that were not taken, like bombing the bridges over the Yalu and doing various other things. But again, that's how it changes. And when what makes these wars so difficult to win is the supply lines are outside of the country. They're coming from other nations that are not really involved, at least not directly. And it would either be prohibitively expensive to attack them or suicidal. If it was the Soviet Union, once they get a sufficient nuclear arsenal, it would be suicidal to attack them directly. But even if you can't attack them directly, like, say, North Vietnam, even if you could, it would be prohibitively expensive for us to have invaded North Vietnam to stop it there, because Johnson was afraid the Chinese might come in again, like they did in Korea. But one of the other things that marks this period is a lot of regime changes, CIA coups. I think probably the two most well-known of this period are in Iran against Mossadegh in 1953, and then I think Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala. Now, one of the things that has been bothering me for a long time is the frankly disinformation about the whole Mossadegh crisis that you get from both the libertarians and the far left. The narrative as they spin it sort of goes like, Mossadegh was a liberal democratic reformer wanting to, now I know libertarians wouldn't approve of his nationalization schemes, but nationalize the oil of Iran to use it for the Iranian people. And the U.S. government didn't like him because he had connections to communists or was suspected to be a communist. And neither did the British, because they weren't going to get their oil if it was nationalized. And so we sent in the guys to, bribe the army and then to take him out. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Frankly, if the United States had not intervened at all, Mossadegh's days were numbered. Iran was a parliamentary regime like the European parliaments, and though with a much more powerful ruler at the time, the Shah. Actually, back it up a bit. We didn't put the Shah in power. I don't know how many times I've heard people say we put the Shah in power. No, the British did. They did that back in 1941 when with the Soviets they invaded and got rid of his dad in World War II. under some trumped-up ridiculous charge that his dad was planning to ally with Hitler at some point, which is ludicrous. Iran was not at all going to do that. So he'd been in power for about 12 years, 13 years by that point. But Mossadegh made the Communist Party, the Tahoud Party, was actually quite influential in the early days of the Cold War. And there's this book written by Kava Farouk called Iran at War, 1500-1988. He gets involved in a lot of this Cold War era stuff. And the Soviets actually tried to fund secessionist groups in northern Iran, around Azerbaijan, with like their front group being the Tahoud Party. And Mossadegh initially allied with the mullahs, Kahani, and it didn't really work out for him very well, because what happened was the mullahs wanted an Islamic Republic even back in the 50s, and they thought we could work with Mossadegh for a while, because they had some mutual interests. But ultimately, he felt that in his coalition government, he allied with the Tahoud, not so much because he was a communist per se, but because they were willing to work with him. But almost everybody hated the Tahoud Party in Iran. That, across the spectrum, the army, the Shah, the mullahs, and then of course the mullahs pretty much were the real power brokers in Iran, as we will later see in 1979. But they were the ones that really had their finger on the pulse of the Iranian people, because it was a very traditionalist, conservative country, and his days were numbered once he allied with the Tahoud. And once the Khomeini turned against him, it was over. So this was going to happen one way or the other. The United States just facilitated that, and the Shah, of course, and the others were grateful for that. But the idea that somehow this laid the groundwork for 79, and that if Mossadegh had stayed in charge, there wasn't an option that Mossadegh would stay in charge. That option isn't on the table, because he was going to be ousted by somebody, whether it was the Islamic mullahs or the king, whatever. He was gone. And second of all, giving the communists any credibility in parliamentary politics is very dangerous. That's what brought down Chiang Kai-shek. We kept on insisting he bring the communist Chinese into his government. And if you do that, you might as well be swallowing fire, because they're gonna haul you out from the inside. So to scoff at the idea that Mossadegh was, say, dangerous in the sense that he would give the communists a foothold indirectly, is I don't think entirely unreasonable. And second of all, the Islamic mullahs and the Shah were dead set against him in being in power at all. So Iran it's not nearly that simple, and a lot of it's just frankly boilerplate from the anti-imperialist crowd. And what people tend to forget too is the Shah was actually a progressive reformer, just like his father was. He gave women the right to vote. He was a secularist. In fact, after he was ousted, he was reported to have said he wished the communists had won rather than the mullahs, because at least the communists were progressive and would lead Iran into the future. Which is an interesting thought coming from the guy that had spent most of his time assassinating communists. And that's the other thing too with this narrative. There's the big bad guy, the Shah. Well, they've had Shahs since for 2,500 years. It's kind of how Iran has been run. The Islamic Republic is quite a new experiment for Iran. And again, we mentioned this before about in World War II. What are the best outcomes in a region? Well, if you look at the country of Iran, the best outcome probably was the Shah, as we saw with the Islamic fundamentalists. Now, fairly dangerous, fairly repressive. Whereas the Shah was willing to play ball, he was willing to modernize. I mean, if you look at pictures of Tehran from like the 60s, it could be like any Western city. You couldn't tell the difference, except the people have a slightly darker shade of skin color. But other than that, it looks just like a regular Western city. And people tend to overlook that about the Shah, and that he was definitely one. I mean, put it this way: the people that criticize the Shah would not want to live under the Islamic State today. They would much prefer to live under the Shah. And again, the people that he terrorized, we see this a lot with the Marxist narrative. It's not like the Shah just went around randomly murdering people. He had two targets in mind: the communists and the Islamic fundamentalists. Frankly, I think a lot of these libertarians and liberals would probably want them out of power as well. So I think it was the Stavak was his secret police. I think that they would be just as opposed to those two parties gaining power in their own country as he was. So it is a far more complicated set of affairs in Iran than just the CIA toppled the democratically elected government. Because frankly, the Shah never left power, so the whole narrative is inadequately described by a lot of these people. Do you have any thoughts on the Iranian coup?
Yeah. I have a somewhat ambiguous view of Iran because, being an American, I was younger when the revolution of '79 happened, and the first time I ever heard of Iran was when that revolution happened, and then there was a seizure of American hostages, and they were kept prisoner in an embassy for about a year and a half, and so that was my first knowledge of Iran, or that there was such a place, and all of that. Ironically, as an adult, I actually do some part-time work as a commentator for an Iranian media network now, Press TV. So I know a lot of Iranians through my work with that, and in other capacities as well. And from my conversations with Iranians about Iranian history and all of the events we've been talking about, the Shah, Mossadegh, Khomeini, all of that, I get a real mixed range of opinion about all of that from Iranians, and some of it falls down into the predictable categories. If their background is more upper class or more upper middle class, they tend to have a more favorable view of the Shah than if they come from a lower income background. Obviously, if they're more religious, they tend to be more pro-Khomeini than if they're not religious. If they belong to the hard left, ironically, a lot of times I have found that they are more sympathetic to Khomeini than they were to the Shah. For example, I know a fellow who is a communist, an Iranian American communist, who actually has a more favorable view of Khomeini than he does of the Shah, because he sees Khomeini as being an anti-imperialist socialist revolutionary, albeit under a religious cover or framework. Whereas he sees the Shah as being this reactionary, plutocratic capitalist stooge, which is interesting. Now this guy is not at all religious at all. I suspect he's probably completely secular, but he does have this view that Khomeini was the more progressive force in that particular situation. I've known other Iranians who would tell me that a problem with the Shah is that while his system of rule was in some ways more liberal, it also had a much more of a slant towards the upper classes. For example, it was true that the upper classes made a lot of money off of Iranian oil wealth, but a lot of that wasn't invested in the country in terms of infrastructure and things like that. Like I know one acquaintance of mine who was from Iran was telling me that prior to the Khomeini revolution, they only had one major highway in Iran, and there wasn't much effort, outside of the major centers where the more wealthy people lived to really develop the country. You were mentioning if you see pictures of Iran prior to the Khomeini revolution, like from say back in the 60s and 70s, it does look like a Western city. I was actually showing some of that material once to a friend of mine from Iran, and what she was telling me is that, yeah, the cities were like that, like Tehran was like that, but the rest of the country wasn't necessarily like that. The rest of the country tended to be more like what you would think of a third world country as looking like. And that those regions were extremely neglected by the Shah's regime. On the other hand, I have known Iranians who had a totally opposite view. I've known Iranians, for example, who say that the Shah was basically a good guy if he wanted to, or at least he was trying to steer the Iranian nation in a more positive direction in terms of development, reform, and things like that. And like you were saying, he was, the people that he was eliminating with his secret police were the would be people like the communists, aligned with the Soviet Union, the Islamic fundamentalists, or the Shia fundamentalists who were later aligned with the Khomeini regime. So there seems to still be a lot of controversy about this situation. It's not just a matter of the whole narrative you get in the West. In the West, you get the narrative that on one hand, there was the democratically elected Mossadegh regime that was trying to steer the Iranian nation towards social democracy, and then the bad guy Americans came in with the CIA and initiated a coup and put in this fascist dictator, the Shah, who was just a puppet for the Americans. And then finally he was overthrown by the Iranian Revolution, which was a great anti-imperialist revolution, except it took a wrong turn and became a reactionary theocratic revolution. That's the standard narrative you get from the left, I guess from libertarians that have a more left-leaning view of international relations or foreign policy, although I haven't really seen much discussion of that from libertarians. It's more the left is really fixated on Iran. But I actually think the truth is much more complicated than that. I mean, some of the issues you were bringing, I think, are bringing up are certainly true in the sense that, well, the rule by the Shah was part of the tradition in Iran. I mean, that's just part of their cultural tradition. And it's also true that Islamic fundamentalism, or very conservative traditional Shia Islam, at least, was always an opposition force and a power to be reckoned with in Iran, and likely would have had influence regardless of what had happened back in 1953. It is true, though, that if you want to look at the Middle East from the perspective of reformers versus reactionaries, which is how the left tends to look at things, the left tends to look at things from this kind of dualistic perspective of, well, you've got people that are more progressive and want to move forward and reform things and advance civilization and all of that. And then you've got the other side that wants to conserve things or wants to go back to some past system, or wants to keep things from stagnant or keep things from reforming. That's the general narrative that the left holds to. But it's hard to really apply that to a narrative to the Middle East in the way that's going to be the basis for any kind of a comprehensive geopolitical narrative. Because, for instance, if you look at Egypt, what you see is that the regimes there that were supported by the United States, like Mubarak and before that Anwar Sadat, were arguably more liberal and more progressive or more Western or whatever than some of the regimes than what has come since the Arab Spring. I mean, the Arab Spring, if anything, I think had it's been widely praised in the West as this people's uprising and against oppressive governments in the Middle East. But if you actually look at the outcome of a lot of that, in some instances, it's instituted more, right wing or conservative or traditional, whatever term we would want to use, than what came before. That a lot of the pro-Western governments you found in some of those countries were actually more liberal than what they've been replaced by. At the same time, there are also anti-Western governments in the Middle East that are more liberal than what they're likely to be replaced by, or what the Americans or other Westerners want to replace them with. Now, one obvious example is Syria. I think certainly the regime of President Assad is far more liberal, secular, modern, Western, whatever, than anything that would likely replace him. On the other hand, Turkey is a ostensibly pro-Western state. It's part of NATO. It's part of the EU, and it seems to be moving in a more increasingly conservative direction, and in terms of imposing more conservative Islamic views on the society and things of that nature as well. And of course, Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most retrograde states in the Middle East, is a staunch American ally. And while Iran is an enemy of the United States today, it's arguably, I would say Iran today is more quote unquote liberal than Saudi Arabia is. So it's you can't really fit this kind of progressive reactionary narrative onto the Middle East in any way that's going to make any sense from a geopolitical perspective. It's more that different states have their own interests, and they align themselves with international power blocks based on those interests. And while some of them may be quote unquote liberal, relatively speaking, or more conservative or reactionary or whatever in other senses, that's not really the fundamental predictor in terms of how they're going to be aligned geopolitically.
Yeah, exactly. Another, like I said, another important coup around this time is the coup in Guatemala against Arbenz. Now, you seem to be more familiar with our history of U.S. interventions in the Caribbean. We mentioned some of those interventions in the last episode. So, how would you want to open up or describe what happened with Arbenz? I imagine the typical left wing narrative is not quite as simple as that.
Well, the from what I know about the situation with Arbenz, Arbenz was a leader that was elected in Guatemala who was touted by the left as being a left-wing, liberal reformer. He was disliked by the right as an ostensible communist. I actually don't see him as being much of either one. He was actually something of a conservative, in my view, or at least a bourgeois conservative, if not a more conventionally right-wing conservative. But he was in favor of charting a somewhat independent course for Guatemala. I think he was opposed to the domination of the Guatemalan economy by the United Fruit and some of that kind of stuff. So that I think was the real source of the Americans' opposition to him. I don't think it was his politics per se, in terms of ideology or any of those kinds of things. And I don't necessarily think he was some great liberal reformer either. I tend to see him as being more like a nationalist. I wouldn't even say he was a revolutionary. I would just say he wanted to move Guatemala in a more nationalistic direction, where Guatemala would have more control over its own internal resources. I don't really think he was really that liberal. I mean, not by Western standards. And he wasn't a communist, although he did have the support of the communists in his anti-American goals. And I think that certainly compounded the situation a bit and fueled the perception of him as that, as someone who was going to be another, well, this is before Fidel Castro, but someone who would have turned out like Fidel Castro. I don't think that was really the issue, though. I do think that the real issue was his nationalism more so than any liberalism or communism that he espoused.
Yeah. Well, you brought up Castro as well. I guess maybe that's the last thing we should end with. Again, I'm not very familiar with the Cuban Revolution, but how would you sketch out the Cuban Revolution?
Well, Cuba was largely an American puppet prior to the Cuban Revolution. In fact, it was run to a large degree by the mafia, by the American mafia. If you go back and read about how Cuba was before Castro, it was kind of like Las Vegas. It was a haven for a lot of gambling interest and prostitution and that kind of stuff. It was like some of the cities that have a reputation for that kind of stuff in Latin America today. Or like the way Bangkok has a reputation for stuff like that in Asia. So what happened was that the Bautista government initially had the support of the United States, and the Castro's guerrilla movement was initiating a revolution against this. And the United States actually wanted to, in my opinion, based on what I know of the events, wanted to co-opt the Castro revolution. They wanted to replace Bautista with Castro and then make Castro into a client of the United States. Castro, being the hardline nationalist that he was not going to have that. He was going to chart an independent course for Cuba. However, he was widely portrayed in his time, during the time that the revolution was going on, as this kind of agrarian reformer who was going to rid the country of rule by American gangsters and sugar plantation owners and give the wealth back to the people and that kind of stuff. It wasn't until after the revolution that after Castro had consolidated his power, that he openly proclaimed himself to be a communist and aligned himself with the Soviet Union. Now, a common narrative has always been that he was pushed towards the Soviet Union by the Americans, that the fact that the Americans would not allow a Cuba that was independent to be fully independent. So that had the results of Castro actually having to find allies elsewhere, and that was the Soviet Union. Now, I don't really think that was the case. I think, I mean, it was in part, but because in the sense that Cuba did become very dependent on the Soviet Union. Ironically, they wanted to be independent. Castro wanted Cuba to be independent of the Americans, and ended up being a Soviet client state instead, which seems to, in many ways, been the same thing in terms of the actual relationship between the nations, between Cuba and major powers. But Castro and Che Guevara, in my view, were doctrinaire communists long before they took power. I think they portrayed themselves as agrarian reformers for the sake of making themselves look good in the Western press. In fact, more so than most third world revolutionaries with a Marxist bent, they were really adept at promoting themselves in the Western media and promoting themselves to the Western left. They tried to portray themselves as these charismatic, Simon Bolivar type of characters that are, fighting for the people, the George Washington of Cuba and all this kind of stuff. But I think they were always doctrinaire communists, and from the time that their movement began. And if you actually look at the kinds of policies that Castro implemented in Cuba, I mean, it was not only hardline communism, but it was, by modern Western standards, it was full-on fascism as well. Imprisoning homosexuals and persecuting the counterculture and all of these kinds of things. And one thing that was also interesting about Castro was he was actually aligned with Francisco Franco as well, and also with Juan Perón. Franco, of course, is considered to have been a fascist. I don't know that that's really an appropriate label for Franco, but he's widely considered by the left to have been a fascist. And as is Juan Perón, he also has the same image among the left. And I think his legacy is somewhat more complicated as well. But Perón and Franco both, could get along at least with fascist regimes, but they could also get along with Castro. And in fact, one of the most interesting critiques of Castro that I have seen was in a libertarian article written by a libertarian some time ago, and I wish I could remember the source. But what this article was basically arguing was that, is that ultimately you can be a fascist and a communist at the same time, and this was using Castro as an example, saying, well, Castro may have been a communist, but he was also a fascist nationalist. He's first and foremost a Cuban nationalist, and he has no problem aligning himself with right-wing regimes that he views as geopolitically advantageous. Whereas, someone, like this article was actually saying, who's further left, a liberal Western capitalist that supports gay marriage and things like that, or someone like Fidel Castro, who's a leftist supposedly, who puts gays in prison and all these other kinds of things. So I do think that's interesting to consider. But one of the most interesting things about him is the way that he became such a popular figure in the West, much more so than a lot of other communists. I don't see today even the kind of idolatry of Mao or the Kims or Stalin among Western leftists that I still see among when it comes to Castro and Che Guevara. I'm not sure why that is, other than the fact that those guys were just better at self-promotion. They just had more natural charisma or whatever the difference would have been. But Cuba under Castro's rule was a Stalinist regime by any standard. I've actually known Cuban exiles who grew up under that system, some of whom were leftists, and what they were, the way they described it was just classic Stalinism. So that is an interesting aspect of Castro's legacy.
So what you mean, they don't have the best society in the world?
Well, not according to people I know who've lived there. But, I've lived there, so I don't know personally, but yeah. I actually used to know a number of anarchists from Cuba some of whom had grown up into that system. In fact, one had actually been kicked out of Cuba by Castro. And all of them said, he's a full-on Stalinist. He's the same thing as Stalin and Kim Il-sung and all of these characters. It's the exact same system. The cult of the leader, cult of the personality.
Well, what's interesting about Cuba? Well, there's two things, obviously. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Without getting into all the intricacies and details, when the Soviets put missiles there, that was a pretty bold move by Khrushchev. I mean, that's pretty ballsy. But we caught him. We saw him with our U-2 spy planes. I think one of the big takeaways from the Cuban Missile Crisis is just how much restraint Kennedy brought to the table. I mean, yeah, lunatics like our friend LeMay, who wanted to do a nuclear first strike on the Soviet Union. I mean, they wanted to have a full-on invasion of Cuba. I mean, some of it, which would have started World War III at that point. So it is interesting that we saw, because normally you think of like Soviet leadership, we think of cold, calculating, rational people that aren't too emotional. You think like a Stalin or a Brezhnev. But it seems like that Khrushchev kind of broke the mold there. He was kind of bellicose and loud, and he had mood swings, and he would do things that were highly risky. The payoff would be big if it works, but if it doesn't, it's bad. And of course, that toehold in the Americas by the communist presence in Cuba was a real concern, because if they had set up those missiles, they would have been within range of Washington. And the other thing too is Cuba wants to pride itself on its anti-imperialism. But if you look at Africa, I mean, really, the Cubans were just the Soviet goon squad. They were like the Soviet Jesuits, just going around, fighting in Angola and in Mozambique and other places to enforce essentially the Soviet imperialist position. So, yesterday's anti-imperialists are today's imperialists, fighting in places like Angola to enforce the communist ideology, which of course I think now the MPLA is walking back on that, because it doesn't make the economy grow.
Yeah, well, as far as the Cuban Missile Crisis, yeah, Kennedy really deserves a lot of credit for the way he handled that. What a lot of people think about Kennedy today, the left or the liberal end of the spectrum tends to think of him as having been a great liberal reformer, and that's kind of the image he has for the left nowadays, and even a lot of conservatives in the United States have that kind of image of Kennedy, as the Kennedy liberal label that's often put on, or used to be put on, a lot of people on the left end of the spectrum. But the way that Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis was really a good illustration of excellent use of statecraft and the principles of realpolitik and all of that. I mean, he handled that very well in a way that was an extremely dangerous situation. I mean, some unhinged leader could have literally triggered a nuclear war in that situation. And I think the way that Kennedy handled it was fairly restrained and very competent. And the one thing that's interesting about Nikita Khrushchev is, like he was saying, he had this image of being very reckless in a lot of the stuff that he would do. I always heard that he had a drinking problem, and that he made a lot of his decisions when he was drunk, which would certainly explain a lot. In fact, I've heard that about Leonid Brezhnev as well, that he actually was intoxicated when he gave the order to invade Afghanistan. I don't know whether that's true or apocryphal, but that does seem to be a pattern. That does seem to be a pattern among Russian leaders. I mean, there's an old video from the 90s of Boris Yeltsin giving a public appearance where he's obviously smashed, so
yeah,
I suppose it's entirely true, but entirely possible at least. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was a pretty dangerous situation, and Kennedy actually handled that very well. He was. I don't really see Kennedy as being as quote unquote left leaning or liberal as many people make him out to be. In terms of what he actually did in policy, if you actually look at the kind of policies he pursued, foreign policy and domestic policy, he wasn't. I wouldn't say he was any further to the left of Ronald Reagan in the sense of what he actually did. Now, Ronald Reagan also lived, was president 20 years later, so the society had changed a lot in that 20 years. But I don't really see Kennedy as being some sort of liberal ideologue in the way that perhaps his brother was, or his younger brother Ted was. But he, I see him actually being kind of conservative in many ways, but in a way that I think was certainly very helpful in terms of the way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. Well, I think we're nearing the end of the allotted time. Is there anything you'd like to add about this period of U.S. policy in the Cold War?
Uh, just there's a lot of stuff about this time period that I think is still not very well known and glossed over, and also interpreted in a way that's fairly wrong-headed. Still a debate that goes on between historians of this time period about the nature of the Cold War. You know, what was really driving the Cold War? Was it the geopolitical rivalry between communists and Western liberal democracy? Was it simply just rival imperialism? You know, what was fueling American foreign policy during this time period? Was it economic imperialism? Was it anti-communism? Was it both? The same thing about the Soviet Union. There's still debates about what was the real policy of the Soviet Union. Was the Soviet Union driven by an ideology seeking world domination? Was it largely trying to counter Western imperialism? A lot of these arguments still go on. And I think that most of the narratives that are usually put forth on this tend to oversimplify things a lot. I just was talking about how we can't really place this whole reformers versus reactionaries narrative on the Middle East in such a way that's going to make power politics in the Middle East make any sense. That the geopolitical issues are much different. And I think that that's somewhat true, perhaps in a different way, in terms of the Cold War as well, that the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States and the United States and the insurgent communist powers around the world, I think it can be interpreted from multiple different angles, and I think all of which are correct up to a certain point. It's a question of emphasis and focus.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming on, Keith. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Five podcast, signing off.